The rain drummed against my uniform as I stood on the front porch of what used to be my home. 18 months of deployment in logistics coordination, managing supply chains across 3 forward operating bases, and this is what I come back to. Zane's silver Camaro parked in my driveway like it belonged there. I'm Darren Halloway, 36 years old, and I've seen enough military politics to know when someone's running a game on me. The upstairs bedroom light was on, casting shadows through the curtains I'd hung before my last deployment. My key still worked, which surprised me. "Seren?" I called out, dropping my duffel bag by the door. The house smelled different, cologne that wasn't mine, takeout containers on the kitchen counter from places I'd never ordered from. The sound of scrambling came from upstairs, hushed voices, a door slamming. I climbed the stairs with the same methodical pace I used during equipment inspections. No rushing, no assumptions, just gathering intel. The master bedroom door was cracked open. Through it, I could see my wife Seren pulling a robe around herself, her dark hair disheveled. Behind her, my half-brother Zane was hopping on one foot, trying to get his jeans on. "Darren!" Seren's voice pitched high, theatrical. "You're supposed to be… When did you…" "Base released us early," I said, stepping into the doorway. My voice stayed level, controlled. "Looks like I should have called ahead." Zane straightened up, his shirt still unbuttoned. At 32, he'd always been the charmer of the family. Real estate agent, smooth talker, the guy who could sell swampland to a developer. Right now, he looked like a teenager caught sneaking out. "Darren, man, this isn't," he started. "Save it." I stepped back from the doorway. "Both of you get dressed. We'll talk downstairs." That's when Seren made her move. "Don't you dare tell me what to do in my own house!" she screamed, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "You come barging in here, threatening us!" I held up my hands, palms out. "I haven't threatened anyone." "You're unstable! Look at you!" She grabbed her phone from the nightstand. "I'm calling the police. Zane, he's dangerous. He could hurt us." My half-brother looked between us, calculating. I could see the moment he chose his side. "Seren's right," Zane said, moving closer to her. "You're acting erratic, man. Maybe deployment messed with your head." I watched my wife dial 911, her performance ramping up with each number she pressed. "Yes, I need police immediately. My husband just returned from military deployment and he's threatening me and my brother-in-law. He seems unstable, possibly violent. Please hurry." The funny thing about 18 months of coordinating logistics under pressure is that you learn to think 3 steps ahead. While Seren painted her picture for the dispatcher, I was already calculating my next moves. I walked downstairs, stepped onto the front porch, and sat on the steps in the rain. When the patrol car arrived 12 minutes later, I was waiting with my hands visible, my military ID ready. Officer Bethany Sharp stepped out of the cruiser. We'd gone to high school together, dated briefly before I enlisted the first time. She was 39 now, divorced, with the kind of tired eyes that came from dealing with small-town drama for 15 years. "Darren Halloway," she said, approaching cautiously. "Been a while." "Evening, Beth. I assume my wife called in a domestic disturbance." "She did. Says you threatened her and your brother." Sharp's hand rested on her radio, professional but not hostile. "What's your side?" "I returned from deployment tonight. Found them together in my bedroom. I didn't raise my voice, didn't threaten anyone. I stepped outside to de-escalate." "Can you verify your deployment status?" I handed her my travel orders and base clearance papers. "Landed at Logan 4 hours ago, drove straight here." Sharp examined the documents under her flashlight. "These look legitimate. Mind if I ask why you're sitting in the rain?" "Because I wanted you to find me calm, compliant, and cooperative when you arrived." I looked up at her. "Beth, I need you to note the exact time of this call and my arrival status in your report. I also need to request body cam footage of this interaction." She raised an eyebrow. "You planning something, Darren?" "I'm planning to protect myself." The front door opened and Seren appeared, now fully dressed, with Zane close behind. She'd been crying, or at least She looked like she had been. "Officer, thank goodness you're here," she said, wrapping her arms around herself. "He just stormed in, yelling, saying terrible things. I was so scared." "Ma'am, can you describe exactly what he said?" Seren glanced at Zane, who nodded encouragingly. He said we'd pay for this, that he'd make us sorry." I stayed seated on the porch steps, letting them dig their own hole. "Officer Sharp, I'd like to make a formal request for your body cam footage of this conversation." "Noted," Sharp said. She looked between the three of us. "Mr. Halloway, your wife is asking you to leave the premises tonight. Are you willing to do that voluntarily?" "I am." "Good. Mrs. Halloway, if you want to file a restraining order, you'll need to go to the courthouse tomorrow morning. Right now, this seems like a domestic issue that's been resolved peacefully." As Sharp walked back to her cruiser, I stood and grabbed my duffel bag. Seren had already disappeared back into the house, but Zane lingered on the porch. "Darren, look, we should talk about this like adults." "We will," I said. "Soon." I drove to the Motel 6 on Route 9, checked into a room that smelled like industrial disinfectant, and made 3 phone calls. First, to the base legal office. I left a detailed voicemail requesting copies of my deployment orders, arrival logs, and any recorded communications regarding my return. Second, to my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who'd lived next door for 8 years and had my emergency contact information. She confirmed what I suspected. She'd called the base welfare office 2 weeks ago when she noticed my house had been occupied while I was supposed to be deployed. Third, to Frankie Morrison, my old army buddy, who now ran a garage in town. Frankie had done 2 tours with me and understood the value of preparation. "Darren? Man, I thought you were still overseas." "Just got back." "Frank, I need a favor. Can you meet me tomorrow morning? I've got a situation that requires some tactical thinking." "Roger that. Coffee shop on Main Street, 800 hours." "Perfect." I hung up and opened my laptop. The home security system I'd installed before deployment was still active, and Seren had apparently forgotten about the cloud backup feature. 3 months of footage, automatically uploaded and stored off-site. I spent the next 2 hours reviewing the highlights. Zane's car appearing in my driveway. Zane entering through the front door, using a key. Seren and Zane together on the couch, in the kitchen, heading upstairs. The timestamps told the whole story. By midnight, I had a complete timeline documented and saved in 3 separate locations. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. As I finally tried to sleep in the narrow motel bed, rain still pattering against the window, I thought about the look on Serene's face when she'd called the police, the calculated performance of it, the way she'd turned to Zane for confirmation before lying to Officer Sharp. 18 months of managing supply chains had taught me that every system has vulnerabilities. Every person who thinks they're running a game has blind spots they don't even know exist. Seren and Zane were about to learn that I'd gotten very good at finding those blind spots. The next morning, I met Frankie at Rosie's coffee shop on Main Street. He looked the same as always, stocky, graying beard, oil permanently embedded under his fingernails. The kind of guy who could fix anything with an engine and wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions about why you needed it fixed. "So," he said, sliding into the booth across from me, "what kind of tactical situation are we talking about?" I filled him in on the previous night's events while he worked through a stack of pancakes. Frankie had a gift for listening without judgment, probably came from years of dealing with military bureaucracy. "Your wife's playing a smart game," he said finally. "Get you out of the house, control the narrative, make you look like the unstable veteran, classic manipulation." "That's what I figured. Question is, how do I counter it?" "Same way we handled supply chain disruptions. Document everything, verify your sources, and always have backup for your backup." He grinned. "Plus, this is a small town. People love gossip, but they hate being lied to even more." We spent the next hour planning my approach. Frankie knew everyone in town. He'd grown up here, unlike me. I'd moved to the area when I married Seren 5 years ago, which meant I was still considered an outsider by local standards. "First stop should be the courthouse," Frankie said. "Get ahead of whatever restraining order she's planning to file. Then we need to talk to people who actually saw what was happening while you were gone." The courthouse was a red brick building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. I found the clerk's office and requested the forms for responding to a restraining order petition, even though Seren hadn't filed one yet. The clerk, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain, looked up from her computer. "You expecting someone to file against you?" "I'm being proactive," I said. "Military habit." "Smart. Most people wait until they're served, then scramble to respond. You got a lawyer?" "Working on it." She handed me a thick packet of forms. "Fill these out completely. If you're military, make sure you include your service records and deployment documentation. Judges take that seriously around here." Next stop was the police station. Officer Sharp was just finishing her shift when I arrived. "Twice in 24 hours, Darren. That's got to be some kind of record." I wanted to follow up on my request for the body cam footage from last night. "Already submitted the request to the sergeant. Should have an answer by Friday." She studied my face. "You look like a man with a plan." "I'm a man who believes in documentation." "Good. Because your wife was here an hour ago filing a restraining order petition. She brought your brother with her as a witness." I felt something cold settle in my stomach, but I kept my expression neutral. "What did they claim?" "Same story as last night, plus some additional details about your threatening behavior and concerns about PTSD. Sharp leaned against the doorframe. "Darren, I've known you since high school. You were never the violent type, even when Tommy Brennan was picking fights with you every week." "I appreciate that, Beth. But I'm also a cop, and I've seen what deployment can do to people. If you're having problems adjusting—" "I'm not," I said firmly. "But I understand why you have to ask." She nodded. "Hearing's scheduled for Thursday morning. Judge Patterson's presiding. He's fair, but he doesn't like games." "Neither do I." I spent the rest of the day making rounds. Mrs. Chen was happy to provide a written statement about the welfare check she'd initiated and her observations of unusual activity at my house during my deployment. The Hendersons, who lived across the street, had also noticed Zane's car and were willing to document what they'd seen. By evening, I had sworn affidavits from 3 neighbors, my complete deployment records, and a timeline that would be very difficult for Seren and Zane to explain away. But I wasn't done gathering intelligence. The VFW post was busy for a Wednesday night. I found Eric Kowalski behind the bar, same as he'd been for the past 10 years. Eric heard everything that happened in town and remembered most of it. "Darren, heard you were back. Also heard there was some drama at your place last night." I ordered a beer and settled onto a bar stool. "News travels fast. Your wife was here earlier today, actually, with that brother of yours, telling anyone who'd listen about how worried she was about you, how deployment changed you, how scared she was to be alone with you. Interesting timing, considering I just got back last night." Eric wiped down a glass, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, that struck me as odd too. She seemed real rehearsed, you know, like she'd been practicing the story. Anyone buy it?" "Some did. Marlene Kowalski, my cousin, works at the hospital with Seren. She was nodding along, very sympathetic. But old Pete Morrison over there?" He gestured to a corner table where a grizzled man in his 70s sat nursing a whiskey. "Pete served 3 tours in Vietnam. He asked some pointed questions about your deployment dates and when these concerning behaviors supposedly started." I glanced over at Pete, who raised his glass in a small salute. "Seren didn't much like being questioned," Eric continued. "Got flustered, started contradicting herself. Your brother had to step in, smooth things over." "What did Zane say?" "That he'd been checking on her regularly while you were gone, making sure she felt safe. Real protective brother-in-law, according to him." The irony wasn't lost on me. "I bet." I spent another hour at the VFW, listening to conversations, and getting a feel for how the story was spreading through town. The consensus seemed split. People who knew me personally were skeptical of Seren's claims, but those who only knew me by reputation were more willing to believe the troubled veteran narrative. That night, back in my motel room, I reviewed the security footage again, this time focusing on creating a detailed log with timestamps and descriptions. Every instance of Zane entering the house, every overnight stay, every moment that contradicted the story they were telling about his protective visits. I also did something else. I researched Seren's social media activity during my deployment. She'd been careful not to post anything obviously incriminating, but the pattern was there. Photos at restaurants I knew she couldn't afford on her hospital salary, check-ins at places she'd never shown interest in before, comments from friends asking about your new guy that had been quickly deleted. The digital footprint told a story she probably didn't realize she was creating. My phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number. Stop digging, or things will get worse for you. I screenshot the message and saved it to my evidence folder. Then I replied, "Who is this?" No response. I had a pretty good idea who'd sent it, though. Zane had always been the type to make vague threats when he felt cornered. The problem was, he'd never been up against someone who'd spent 18 months coordinating complex logistics under pressure. Tomorrow was Thursday. Tomorrow was the hearing. Tonight, I finalized my strategy. Judge Patterson's courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with wood paneling that had probably been impressive in 1985, but now just looked tired. I sat at the respondent's table with the lawyer I'd hired that morning, Janet Mills, a local attorney who specialized in family law and had a reputation for being thorough. Seren sat across the aisle with her attorney, a slick-looking guy in an expensive suit who'd driven up from Boston. Zane was in the gallery behind her, wearing what I recognized as his trustworthy real estate agent outfit, navy blazer, khakis, and a concerned expression. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Judge Patterson was a man in his 60s with gray hair and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested he'd heard every sob story and manipulation tactic in the book. He reviewed the petition for several minutes before looking up. "Mrs. Halloway, you're requesting a restraining order against your husband based on alleged threatening behavior following his return from military deployment. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Seren said, her voice trembling slightly. She'd dressed conservatively, blouse buttoned high, minimal makeup, the picture of a frightened wife. "Mr. Halloway, how do you respond to these allegations?" I stood. "I deny them completely, Your Honor. I believe the evidence will show that this petition is part of an attempt to manipulate the legal system for personal gain." Patterson's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's a serious accusation. I hope you can back it up." "I can, Your Honor." The hearing proceeded with Seren's testimony first. She painted a picture of a husband who'd returned from deployment, changed and angry, who'd stormed into the house making threats and left her fearing for her safety. Her lawyer was good. He led her through the testimony smoothly, hitting all the right emotional notes. When he was finished, Seren was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Then it was Janet's turn to cross-examine. "Mrs. Halloway, you testified that your husband threatened you the night he returned from deployment. What exactly did he say?" "He said we'd pay for what we'd done, that he'd make us sorry." "Us? Who is us?" "My brother-in-law and me." "And what had you done that would require payment or cause for sorry?" Seren's attorney objected, but Patterson overruled him. "Answer the question, Mrs. Halloway." We hadn't done anything. That's why I was so scared. He was being irrational." Janet nodded and moved to the evidence table. "Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Exhibit A, body cam footage from Officer Sharp's interaction with all parties on the night in question." The footage played on a small screen visible to the court. It showed me sitting calmly on the porch steps, speaking in measured tones. while Seren made increasingly dramatic accusations that didn't match the officer's observations. "Mrs. Halloway, does this footage show your husband making threats?" "Not on camera, but..." "Yes or no, please." "No, but that doesn't mean..." "Thank you. Now you testified that your husband's behavior was erratic and concerning. When did you first notice these concerning behaviors?" "When he came home that night. So these behaviors began the moment he returned from deployment." "Yes." Janet introduced Exhibit B, my deployment records and travel documentation. "Your Honor, these records show that Mr. Halloway was continuously deployed overseas for 18 months, returning only on the night in question. Mrs. Halloway, if your husband was overseas for 18 months, how could you have observed concerning behavior before the night he returned?" Serene's face flushed. "I was worried about how deployment might have changed him." "But you testified to observing specific behaviors, not hypothetical concerns." The cross-examination continued for another 20 minutes, with Janet systematically dismantling Seren's timeline and exposing the contradictions in her story. Then Zane took the stand. He testified about being concerned for his sister-in-law's safety and making regular check-ins while I was deployed. He described the night I returned as tense and threatening, claiming he'd only been at the house to provide emotional support. Janet's cross-examination of Zane was surgical. "Mr. Marinor, you testified that you made regular check-ins on Mrs. Halloway. How regular?" "Once or twice a week." "And these check-ins involved what activities?" "Just making sure she was okay. Sometimes we'd have dinner, watch a movie." "Where did these activities take place?" "Usually at the house." Janet introduced Exhibit C, the security camera footage I'd compiled, with timestamps clearly visible. "Your Honor, this footage shows Mr. Marinor's vehicle at the Halloway residence on 63 separate occasions during Mr. Halloway's deployment, with overnight stays documented on 41 of those occasions." Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. The courtroom was quiet. Seren's face had gone pale. "Mr. Marinor, would you characterize staying overnight 41 times as once or twice a week check-ins?" Zane's composure cracked. Sometimes it got late, and it seemed safer to stay over rather than drive home." "Safer for whom?" For everyone." "And where did you sleep during these overnight stays?" That's not relevant to..." "Answer the question, Mr. Marinor." Zane looked at his sister-in-law's attorney, who was frantically taking notes but couldn't object to a direct question about his client's testimony. "Sometimes on the couch," Zane said finally. "Sometimes?" "Your Honor," Serene's attorney stood up. "I fail to see how sleeping arrangements are relevant to the question of whether Mr. Halloway poses a threat." "I'll allow it," Patterson said. His expression had shifted from neutral to distinctly skeptical. "Answer the question, Mr. Marinor." "Sometimes I stayed in the guest room." Janet nodded and moved to her final exhibit. "Your Honor, I'd like to introduce sworn affidavits from 3 neighbors who observed Mr. Marinor's vehicle and documented suspicious activity at the Halloway residence during Mr. Halloway's deployment." She handed copies to the judge and opposing counsel. Patterson read through them carefully, his frown deepening. When Janet was finished with her cross-examination, it was my turn to testify. I kept it simple and factual. Deployment timeline, return home, discovery of the situation, my decision to de-escalate by leaving voluntarily, my cooperation with law enforcement. "Mr. Halloway," Seren's attorney said during cross-examination, "isn't it true that you felt angry and betrayed when you discovered your wife with another man?" "I felt disappointed," I said. "Disappointed enough to seek revenge?" "Disappointed enough to seek the truth." "And what truth is that?" I looked directly at Seren, then at Zane. That this restraining order petition is an attempt to cover up an affair by painting me as an unstable veteran who can't be trusted. It's a manipulation of the legal system, and it's an insult to every service member who's actually struggling with deployment-related issues. Judge Patterson called a brief recess to review the evidence. When court reconvened, his decision was swift. I've reviewed all testimony and evidence presented today. Mrs. Halloway, your petition for a restraining order is denied. The evidence clearly shows that your husband posed no threat and that this petition appears to have been filed in bad faith. He looked sternly at both Seren and her attorney. I'm also noting in the record my concerns about the potential misuse of protective order procedures. Mr. Halloway, you're free to return to your residence. As the courtroom cleared, Seren and Zane huddled with their attorney near the exit. I caught fragments of their heated conversation, something about other options and Plan B. Janet packed up her files. Nice work on the evidence collection. Most people don't think that far ahead. Military training, I said. Always have a backup plan. Well, your backup plan just saved you from a lot of legal trouble. But Darren? She looked at me seriously. This isn't over. People who file false restraining orders don't usually give up after one loss. I nodded. I'm counting on it. That evening, I returned to my house for the first time in 3 days. Seren and Zane were gone, but they'd left evidence of their hasty departure. Clothes scattered in the bedroom, dishes in the sink, a bottle of wine on the counter that I'd never seen before. I spent the evening documenting everything and changing the locks. My phone buzzed with another text from the same unknown number. You think you won today. You have no idea what's coming. I screenshot the message and added it to my evidence file. Then I opened my laptop and began researching Seren's social media connections, Zane's business associates, and the network of people they'd been spreading their story to. The courthouse victory was just the first battle. The real war was about to begin. The Founders' Day festival was scheduled for the following Saturday, which gave me exactly 1 week to execute the next phase of my plan. In a town this size, the festival was the social event of the year. Everyone would be there, including everyone who'd heard Seren and Zane's version of events. I spent Thursday evening at Frankie's garage, helping him work on a transmission while we discussed strategy. The thing about small towns, Frankie said, wiping grease off a wrench, is that reputation is everything. Your wife and brother did some damage this week, but they also made themselves vulnerable. How so? They told their story to anyone who'd listen. Problem is, they told it before they knew what evidence you had. Now that the judge threw out the restraining order, people are going to start wondering what else they lied about. I handed him a socket wrench. I need to accelerate that process. What did you have in mind? I outlined my plan. Frankie listened, occasionally grinning or shaking his head. That's either brilliant or completely insane, he said when I finished. Maybe both. Friday morning, I visited Mayor Wilkins at his office in the town hall. Robert Wilkins was a politician in the classic small-town mold, friendly to everyone, committed to nothing, and always looking for the angle that would benefit him most. Darren, good to see you back safely. I heard there was some domestic turbulence this week. There was, but it's been resolved legally and factually. I sat down across from his desk. Bob, I'd like to speak at the festival tomorrow, during the community recognition portion. Wilkins shifted uncomfortably. Well, that's usually reserved for local business owners, community volunteers, people who've made contributions while I was serving my country? That's not what I meant. I think it's exactly what you meant. But here's the thing, Bob. I've got some things to say about truth, service, and community support. Things that might interest the voters who'll be deciding whether to re-elect you next year. The implied threat wasn't subtle, but it didn't need to be. Wilkins was the kind of politician who could smell a public relations disaster from 3 counties away. Of course. Military service should always be recognized. I'll put you on the schedule. Thank you. I'll keep my remarks brief. That afternoon, I made another round of visits. The hardware store where Zane bought supplies for his real estate renovations. The restaurant where he and Seren had been seen together. The dry cleaner where Seren had her work clothes done. I wasn't making accusations or spreading gossip. I was just a recently returned veteran, reconnecting with the community, asking how people were doing, mentioning in passing that I was looking forward to setting the record straight about recent events. People talked. They always did. Saturday morning dawned clear and warm, perfect festival weather. Main Street was closed to traffic, lined with vendor booths and decorated with red, white, and blue bunting. The smell of fried dough and barbecue filled the air. I arrived early and found Frankie manning a booth for his garage, offering free brake inspections and oil change coupons. "You ready for this?" he asked. "As ready as I'll ever be." The festival crowd grew throughout the morning. I made a point of walking through the vendor areas, stopping to chat with people I knew, shaking hands, accepting condolences about my difficult week with appropriate humility. I also kept an eye on Seren and Zane, who arrived around noon and seemed to be working their own version of damage control. They stayed together, moving through the crowd in a coordinated pattern, talking to specific groups of people. The community recognition ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock at the main stage. Mayor Wilkins introduced local business award winners, volunteer appreciation, and scholarship recipients before getting to the military recognition portion. Ladies and gentlemen, we're honored today to recognize one of our own who recently returned from overseas deployment. Please welcome Army Logistics Officer Darren Halloway. The applause was polite, but not overwhelming. I walked to the microphone and looked out over the crowd of maybe 300 people. Seren and Zane were standing near the back, their expressions tense. "Thank you, Mayor Wilkins, and thank you all for this recognition. 18 months overseas gives you a lot of time to think about home, about community, about the values we're supposed to represent." I paused, letting the crowd settle. I learned this week that some people in our community have been spreading stories about me, stories about instability, about threats, about dangerous behavior. These stories led to police calls, legal proceedings, and a lot of unnecessary drama. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. People were looking around, trying to figure out where this was going. I want to address those stories directly, because this community deserves the truth. I pulled out a folder and opened it. The truth is that I returned from deployment on Tuesday night to find my wife in bed with my half-brother. The truth is that when I discovered this situation, I didn't threaten anyone, didn't raise my voice, and didn't engage in any violent behavior. I stepped outside and waited for police to arrive. The murmurs grew louder. I could see Seren's face reddening from across the crowd. The truth is that my wife immediately called police and filed false accusations against me, claiming I had threatened her and was unstable from deployment. These accusations were proven false in court Thursday morning when a judge reviewed security camera footage, police body cam evidence, and sworn testimony from multiple witnesses. Now the crowd was fully engaged. This was better than any soap opera. The truth is that while I was serving overseas, my half-brother spent 41 nights in my house, sleeping in my bed with my wife, while telling anyone who asked that he was checking on her for safety reasons. Someone in the crowd gasped. Several people turned to stare at Seren and Zane. I'm sharing this information not to embarrass anyone, but because false accusations against veterans are serious. They waste police resources, clog up our legal system, and damage the credibility of real victims who need protection. I closed the folder and looked directly at the section of crowd where Seren and Zane were standing. I also want to thank the neighbors who provided truthful testimony, the police officer who documented everything professionally, and the judge who saw through the manipulation and dismissed the false charges. The applause this time was much stronger. I could see people nodding, talking to each other, looking back toward where Seren and Zane had been standing. But they weren't standing there anymore. They were pushing through the crowd toward the parking area, trying to leave without attracting more attention. Too late for that. In closing, I said. I want to remind everyone that truth has a way of coming out, especially in a community like ours where people look out for each other. Thank you for your time, and thank you for supporting our military families, the real ones. I stepped away from the microphone to sustained applause. Mayor Wilkins looked like he'd swallowed something unpleasant, but he managed to thank me and move on to the next part of the program. For the rest of the afternoon, I was surrounded by people wanting to hear more details, offering support, and sharing their own suspicions about what they'd observed during my deployment. The narrative had shifted completely. By evening, when the festival was winding down, the consensus was clear. Seren and Zane were the villains of this story, and I was the wronged veteran who'd handled a terrible situation with dignity and restraint. Frankie found me as I was walking back to my truck. Well, he said, I think it's safe to say that phase of the operation was successful. Phase 1, I corrected. This was just setting the stage. What's phase 2? I looked back at the festival crowd, people still talking in animated groups about what they'd heard. Phase 2 is making sure they can never come back from this. By Monday morning, the story had spread through every social network in town. The coffee shop, the grocery store, the hospital where Seren worked, everyone was talking about the festival revelation and reassessing everything they thought they knew about the situation. I was having breakfast at Rosie's when Marlene Kowalski approached my table. She was Serene's closest friend and had been one of her most vocal supporters during the previous week's drama. Darren, I owe you an apology, she said, wringing her hands. Seren seemed so scared, and the way she described things. You believed a friend who was lying to you, I said. That's not your fault, Marlene. But I should have known better. Looking back, there were signs. The way she talked about Zane, how much time they were spending together. I just didn't want to think. Most people don't want to think the worst of their friends. She nodded gratefully and hurried away, probably to call every person she'd spoken to the previous week and revise her story. That afternoon, I got a call from Janet Mills. Darren, I'm not sure what you said at that festival, but I've had 3 people contact me today asking about filing defamation suits against your wife and brother. Interesting. It's more than interesting. Apparently, they've been telling different versions of their story to different people, and now that the truth is out, folks are realizing how extensively they were lied to. I made a note to follow up with those potential witnesses. Anything else? Your wife's attorney called. They want to discuss a mutual agreement regarding property division and divorce proceedings. Tell them I'll consider it after I've finished documenting all the damage they've done. How much more documenting are you planning to do? As much as it takes. That evening, I drove past Zane's condo complex. His silver Camaro wasn't in its usual parking spot. A neighbor I'd spoken to at the festival had mentioned that Zane seemed to be laying low since Saturday. I found him at Murphy's Tavern, a dive bar on the outskirts of town where he probably thought he could avoid the gossip and stares. He was sitting alone at the end of the bar, working on what looked like his 4th or 5th whiskey. I took the stool next to him and ordered a beer. Hello, Zane. Darren, come to gloat? Come to talk. About what? You already destroyed us in front of the whole town. I sipped my beer. I told the truth in front of the whole town. There's a difference. The truth. He laughed bitterly. You want to know the truth? The truth is that Seren was miserable with you. The truth is that she needed someone who actually paid attention to her, who made her feel special. The truth is that you're both cowards who couldn't end one relationship before starting another. Zane's face flushed with anger. You self-righteous piece of... Careful, I said quietly. We're in public, and you've already got a reputation for poor decision-making. He glared at me but lowered his voice. What do you want, Darren? I want you to understand what's going to happen next. Which is? You're going to leave town. Both of you. You're going to pack up, find jobs somewhere else, and start over with a clean slate. And if we don't? I pulled out my phone and showed him a photo. Zane's car parked in my driveway at 2 a.m., time-stamped from 3 months ago. Then I released the complete timeline of your affair to every real estate agency within 50 miles, along with documentation of how you used my house for your business meetings while I was deployed. His face went pale. You can't prove... I can prove everything, Zane. Security cameras, credit card records, witness statements, social media posts. I've got 18 months of evidence documenting exactly what you two were doing while I was serving my country. I showed him another photo, a screenshot of a social media post where Seren had tagged him at an expensive restaurant with the caption, "Thanks for a perfect evening," and a heart emoji. That was posted while I was coordinating supply drops for combat units, while I was working 16-hour days to make sure soldiers had the equipment they needed to stay alive. Zane stared at the phone screen, his hands shaking slightly. Here's what's going to happen, I continued. You're going to resign from your real estate position, citing personal reasons. Seren's going to resign from the hospital. You're both going to leave town quietly, and you're never going to contact me or anyone in my family again. And if we do that, then I keep the evidence to myself. You get to start over somewhere else without this following you. That's blackmail. That's consequences. Zane finished his whiskey in one gulp. How long do we have? 2 weeks. And if we don't? I stood up and left money on the bar for both our drinks. Then I make sure everyone knows exactly who you really are. I walked out of Murphy's Tavern and drove home, where I spent the evening organizing the final phase of my documentation project. Bank records showing unusual expenses during my deployment. Phone records showing the frequency of calls and texts between Seren and Zane. Social media archives that painted a clear picture of their relationship timeline. By Wednesday, word was spreading that Zane had given notice at his real estate office. By Friday, Seren had submitted her resignation at the hospital, citing family circumstances. The gossip network that had initially worked against me was now working in my favor. People were sharing stories about things they'd noticed during my deployment, suspicious behavior they'd dismissed at the time, lies they now realized they'd been told. Mayor Wilkins called me Friday afternoon. Darren, I wanted to thank you for your remarks at the festival. Very enlightening. Just sharing the facts, Bob. Yes, well, the facts have certainly clarified things. I also wanted to let you know that several people have approached me about recognizing your service in a more formal way. Perhaps a commendation from the town council? That's not necessary. I think it is. After what you've been through, after the way you've handled this situation, it sends the right message about how we treat our veterans. What it really sent was a message about how Mayor Wilkins wanted to position himself relative to the story, but I didn't point that out. Saturday morning, I was loading boxes into my truck. Seren's belongings that she'd asked me to leave on the porch rather than face me in person, when Frankie pulled into the driveway. Heard they're leaving tomorrow, he said. So I understand. You feel good about how this played out? I thought about the question while I carried another box outside. Did I feel good? Satisfied, certainly. Justice had been served, in a sense. The truth had come out, and there had been consequences for the people who'd tried to manipulate the system and destroy my reputation. But good? That was more complicated. I feel like I did what needed to be done, I said finally. That's probably the best any of us can hope for. Sunday afternoon, I watched from my front window as Zane loaded the last of Seren's belongings into a U-Haul trailer. Seren sat in the passenger seat of his car, wearing sunglasses and staring straight ahead. They drove away without looking back. Monday morning, I returned to my normal routine for the first time in 2 weeks. Coffee at Rosie's, where the waitress smiled and asked how I was settling back in. A stop at the hardware store for supplies to repair the damage they'd done to the house. A visit to the base employment office to discuss transitioning my military logistics experience into civilian supply chain management. Life was moving forward. That evening, my phone rang. Unknown number, but this time I recognized the voice. You think you won? Seren said. You think you destroyed us. I think I held you accountable for your choices. We could have worked this out privately, Darren. We could have handled the divorce quietly, split things fairly. You could have ended our marriage before starting your affair. You could have been honest instead of filing false police reports. You had a lot of opportunities to handle this differently. I loved him. Then you should have divorced me first. There was a long silence. I hope you're happy, she said finally. I'm satisfied, I replied, and hung up. I never heard from either of them again. The story became part of local legend, the veteran who came home to betrayal and fought back with documentation instead of violence, who used truth as a weapon more effectively than any physical confrontation could have been. People still talk about it at the VFW, at town council meetings, at the annual Founders' Day festival. It became a cautionary tale about the consequences of lying, about the importance of supporting military families, about how the truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deeply people try to bury it. As for me, I rebuilt my life methodically, the same way I'd built my case against Seren and Zane. New job in supply chain management for a regional manufacturing company. New relationships with people who valued honesty and integrity. New routines that didn't include looking over my shoulder or wondering who was betraying me. The house still sits on Maple Street, but I've made it mine again. New locks, new security system, new memories to replace the ones that were poisoned by deception. Sometimes people ask me if I regret how I handled the situation, if I think I was too harsh or too public in my response. I tell them the same thing I told Frankie that day at his garage. I did what needed to be done. In the end, that's all any of us can do.